Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso. And today we're going to be looking at one of the most common questions in watches. Are in-house movements really worth it? Now I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, this video won't directly answer that. Instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore the different facets of that question in the sense that there is a big gray area between in-house movement and an off-the-shelf movement, which is usually an ETA. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to break down the advantages of the two extremes, off the shelf versus in-house, and then I'm going to look at some of the gray areas so we can at least start the conversation and see, is an in-house movement really worth getting? But first let's start out with in-house movements themselves. The three main advantages to an in-house movement, first and foremost, is the exclusivity. Let's not beat around the bush. People like the idea of having an in-house movement. It makes them feel like they're getting more value from the brand and the brand is putting more of itself on the line for it. But there's another advantage to that exclusivity, and that's also security. There's a lot of really high-end fakes these days that use ETA movements or ETA clones so that they can make the watch look more legitimate. And we all know that one of the best ways to tell if a watch is fake or not is the movement. So if it's easier for counterfeiters to obtain ETA movements because they're so mass produced, for example, it means it's easier for them to create a more authentic looking fake. Whereas with an in-house movement, by sheer lack of numbers and availability, it makes it a lot harder for counterfeiters to get their hands on the movement to make a copy of it. So that's an added benefit of that exclusivity that most people maybe don't consider. And the last advantage is, of course, that it opens the door for innovation. Because they're making something new, they're making something from scratch. When they design something from the ground up, it allows them to make it better. It allows them to explore new ways, new technologies, new techniques, everything that allows watchmakers to advance the technology of watchmaking forward. So it's definitely got its pros. The downsides are, of course, the most obvious one being the cost. Making and developing a movement is really expensive. It can cost upwards of millions of dollars. So it is something that is very prohibitive, and that cost also gets passed on to us as consumers. But another disadvantage to us as consumers is also it's more expensive to service. If a manufacturer is the only one making that movement, it means most other watchmakers don't have much experience in repairing that movement, or they don't know or have access to the schematics to be able to repair that movement or to know how it works. So it just makes it more expensive to service that movement in the long term. It means you're locked into taking it direct to the manufacturer only. And when your warranty is expired, those expenses can start to pile up. And then the last disadvantage is that yes, while in-house movements do offer a lot of room for innovation, it also means that consumers end up getting used as the test bed for it. So it does mean that there's less of that reliability that you have when you compare it to off-the-shelf movements that have been around and been developed over the last 40, 50 years in some cases. So it does have its downsides, but definitely a lot of upsides as well. Now let's look at the other side of the argument, and that's off-the-shelf movements, and that usually means ETA or Sellita, which is a company that makes clones of ETA movements because of the expired patents on them. Now the advantage, of course, to an ETA movement or an off-the-shelf movement is cost. It's a lot cheaper to buy something that's mass-produced and that's been made for decades because ETA has already recouped its development costs on a lot of its movements. So it means that they can just charge a really low price and sell it to as many people as possible. And because they've been around for so long, it also means that these off-the-shelf movements have already been tested. There's already a level of reliability that's understood by them, and it's cheaper for other watchmakers to repair them because they've known them for years or decades in some cases. So it means that there's a lot more options for us as consumers to get an ETA or a Sellita movement repaired versus an in-house movement that's exclusive to a certain brand. But there are the downsides as well. Obviously, there is the lack of exclusivity and that sort of intangible brand snobbery, whatever you want to call it. There is that feeling that if you have a mass-produced movement, it just doesn't feel as special. Even if it's not necessarily justified, it's not even necessarily a case where they're inferior quality, it just feels like it's not as special because you know it happens to be in tons of other watches as well. The other disadvantage though is that it means that watch manufacturers need to actually conform to the movement when they're designing and making a watch. An example of this would be the Valjoux 7750, which is a very thick movement. So that's why you have a lot of watches that use that movement end up being very thick overall, because it means that because of some sort of cost constraint, they've been designed with that movement in mind, as opposed to being designed to be thinner and more ergonomic. At the end of the day, it's a compromise that watch manufacturers have to make. If they're going to be getting an off-the-shelf movement, they're stuck with making a watch that's based around that movement. Of course, there are other manufacturers that aren't ETA or Sellita that can provide thinner movements. In the case, for example, you have the Frédéric Piguet 1185, which was used in the Vacheron Constantin overseas chronograph and the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak chronograph. That was a case where obviously they couldn't turn to something like ETA, and also a company like Frédéric Piguet also offers a lot more cachet. It's a much higher end watch manufacturer, so it doesn't have that lack of exclusivity feeling that perhaps an ETA would, for example. And that's one of the first gray areas that I want to highlight, is you do have other watch and caliber manufacturers that do make high-end movements that still have that same weight behind their manufacturing process and their reputation, but they still offer an opportunity for higher-end watch manufacturers at least to cut some costs and focus more on maintaining their independence. In the case of Audemars Piguet or Patek Philippe, for example, both of which used a Jaeger-LeCoultre movement in their original Royal Oak and Nautilus respectively, but that means they don't have to compromise on their integrity when it comes to providing a watch that's of the highest quality. Another gray area in this debate that's worth considering is movement modifications and modules. I mentioned before that one of the advantages to an in-house movement is the innovation aspect. Well, that's not necessarily the case that you can't innovate with an off-the-shelf movement. Montblanc, for example, in their Geosphere, that uses a Sellita SW300, which is a clone of an ETA 2892. It uses that as a base, so to cover the basic 3-hand and seconds part of the watch, but then they add their own in-house module to that movement to add in their double hemisphere world time function. So that's an example of innovation while using an off-the-shelf movement. So it means that they could save money on the basic part that was nothing new, nothing special, just 3 hands, but it meant they could spend that money on creating a new way to present a world timer. Another example is the Tag Heuer Isograph, which uses an SW200, but they put in their own carbon composite hairspring, which they originally developed on the Heuer O2. What this means is that they can actually mass produce these hairsprings without having to sell them on a watch that costs nearly $20,000 in the case of the O2T, which was a tourbillon in which they debuted this technology. So there is room for innovation with off-the-shelf movements, but it comes in the form of modules or specific modifications that add a new technology. Even my Omega, for example, uses a caliber 2500, which was originally based on a 2892, but they added in their coaxial escapement, which they've now perfected with their own in-house movements, albeit they're still made by ETA, but they're made exclusively by ETA for Omega, and they are both part of this watch group. And that brings us on to the last gray area in this debate, and that's internal sharing. The watch world is currently dominated by 3 major groups, and that's the Swatch Group, which owns ETA, LVMH, which owns companies like Hublot, Tag Heuer, and Zenith, and then there's the Richemont Group, which owns companies like Cartier, Vacheron Constantin, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and several others. So these big groups, they do share within themselves. Obviously the Swatch Group, it's easy to see how that works because they own ETA, which also has been known for sharing with tons of other brands. But when you look at something like Richemont, they use this internal sharing to their advantage in a major way. Vacheron Constantin was able to provide a watch at a lower price point without compromising its integrity by using the Cartier caliber 1904 in its 56 range. And Richemont managed to do the opposite with Montblanc, again with the MB 25.10. With that movement, they actually used the IWC 69370 movement in their Time Walker chronograph manufacture. What that allowed them to do was to push the brand and push that model up market instead of using the outsourced movements that they use in the rest of their Time Walker line. So there's a lot of gray area in this debate, and it's really important to consider that when you think about, is an in-house movement really worth it or not? Because the reality is it's not a binary decision between just in-house and off-the-shelf. And it would be worth looking at all these different aspects to see which one is really the best option. There probably is no real answer, but I'd still like to explore this further. So let me know in the comments below what you think of it so far. Let me know what you think of these gray areas and what's your stance on the question so far, and whether this video has helped maybe change that or at least add some more perspective to it. And if you like the video, please do like it and share it. And if you like seeing new watch content every week, make sure you subscribe to Shaluso. And of course, last but not least, thank you for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.